Rejected, broken, and back among the pack. Aven thought she could hold her distance, but on the southern watch, danger pressed close, and so did Thorne. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind that wrapped the world in mist and made every sound carry twice as far. Aven pulled her cloak tighter as she crossed the yard, the leather of her boots damp already with dew. Wolves moved in twos and threes, shaking off sleep, shouldering weapons. At the southern gate, Thorne stood waiting. He looked as he had last night, older, carved into steadiness by rank and time. But the sight of him in the new light sent her heart into a gallop she fought to disguise. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. They set out along the border trail, silence settling between them as naturally as breath. The mist curled low, brushing their knees, and the trees stood in still ranks like watchers. Birds called, tentative, as if uncertain whether the day meant safety. For a while, the only sounds were boots on damp earth and the whisper of the wind through pine needles. It was Thorne who broke the silence. "You walk differently." Aven glanced at him, wary. 2 years of uneven ground in the valley will do that. "No," he said, shaking his head slightly. "Not just that. You move like someone who knows she doesn't need anyone to cover her back." Aven's mouth quirked. "I learned quickly." He studied her a moment longer before his gaze swept the trees again. "I see that." The bond pressed between them, thick as fog. She tried to ignore it, tried to think only of the path, the line of the trees, the listening silence. But the longer they walked, the heavier it grew. Finally, she said, more sharply than she meant to, "You don't have to make conversation, Thorne. We can walk in silence." He stopped, turning toward her. "I'm not making conversation, Aven. I'm trying to remind you that I see who you've become." Her breath caught. She looked away, back to the mist. "You didn't see me before." He flinched as if she'd struck him, but he didn't deny it. They walked on. Minutes stretched. The silence grew barbed, full of things unsaid. At last Aven spoke again, her voice low, almost lost to the wind. 2 years is a long time. I'm sure you didn't spend them alone." The words slipped out, sharper than she'd intended, but once loosed, they could not be taken back. Thorne stopped walking. The mist coiled between them, pale and cold. He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, steady and unflinching. "There was no one," he said. His voice held no hesitation, no shame. "Not before you, not after, not ever." Aven's heart lurched. She opened her mouth, closed it, shook her head. "You expect me to believe that? A man like you, beta now, respected. Don't tell me there weren't women willing." "I'm not saying there weren't offers," Thorne said evenly. "I'm saying they were meaningless. The bond doesn't let me want anyone else, Aven. It never did. The moment it woke in me—" His throat worked, and for a beat his voice broke. "It was only you." Her breath came uneven. The bond hummed hot in her chest, responding to his words, to the truth in them. She wanted to believe him, desperately, but the memory of his old dismissal cut just as sharply. "Then why say what you did?" she whispered. Regret darkened his face. "Because I was a coward who thought words could shield me from things I wasn't ready to feel. And because I was blind." The forest pressed close, heavy with mist and silence. Before Aven could speak again, a sound cracked the stillness. A sharp snap of wood, close and deliberate, both stilled, instincts sharpening. Thorne's hand dropped to the hilt of his blade. Aven notched an arrow in one fluid motion. Together, they pivoted toward the sound. Through the mist, a shape emerged, a snare strung between trees, bait laid fresh, the ground around it disturbed with tracks that did not belong to their pack. Aven's jaw tightened. Northlanders. Thorne's gaze flicked to her, grim agreement in his eyes. "They're testing us, pushing closer." The conversation they'd just had hung between them, raw and unfinished. But for now, It had to wait. They were wolves on the border again. The Southern Patrol returned just as the sun climbed past the treetops. The camp bustled with noise, clattering sparring staffs, the sharp rhythm of axe on wood, voices rising in banter and command. Smoke curled from the cook fires, heavy with the scent of fresh bread. Aven carried her bow slung across her back as she crossed the yard. She could feel eyes on her, whispers trailing in her wake, but she kept her chin high, her stride steady. Inside, her thoughts tangled around the morning's words. There was no one but you. They blazed in her chest with a heat that almost frightened her. She wanted to believe them. She wanted not to. Aven! Her mother's voice pulled her around just in time to be engulfed in a hug that smelled of flower and rosemary. Mayra pulled her close as if she could make up for 2 years of absence with sheer strength. Aven let herself be folded in, her eyes stinging. "You're thinner," her mother muttered, pulling back to study her face. "But taller. God's child, you've grown into yourself." Before Aven could answer, her younger sister barreled into her, all elbows and laughter. "You're really back? You don't look like a ghost." Her father appeared in the doorway behind them, his large frame filling the space. He didn't rush. He never did. He stepped forward and rested his hands on her shoulders, his eyes searching hers. He didn't speak, but his nod said enough. They swept her inside, and soon she was pressed into a chair with a steaming mug in her hands and bread thrust at her from 3 directions at once. Her siblings crowded close, their chatter tripping over itself. "Tell us about the Valley Pack. Did they make you hunt every day? Did you meet anyone? Did you—" "Let her breathe," her father rumbled, though the corner of his mouth betrayed the ghost of a smile. Aven managed to answer some questions: how the mountains looked in winter, how the valley wolves used carved whistles to signal hunts, how the healer she worked under could identify 50 herbs by scent alone. She left out the hollow, the aching nights, the bond. Her mother listened more than she spoke, her hand smoothing over Aven's hair again and again. "The Alpha is glad you're back," she said softly. "The pack is stronger with all its bloodlines whole." The words caught in Aven's chest. Stronger. Whole. The pack would see her return as duty fulfilled, but her mother's eyes, lingering, unreadable, told her it was more complicated. By afternoon, the news had spread fully. Wherever she went, wolves glanced at her with interest that burned like a spotlight. Some nodded in welcome. Some watched too long, curiosity sharper than kindness. She could feel the gossip weaving already, threads too tangled to catch. 2 younger warriors sparred in the training yard as she passed, their voices carried, unbothered by her presence. "Careful, don't let her distract you." As if Beta Thorne needs her to. The rest was drowned in laughter. Heat rose in Aven's cheeks, though she didn't stop. She kept walking, every step measured, every breath steady. But the bond inside her stirred at his name, restless and insistent, making it impossible to ignore the sting of their words. Later, one of the older she-wolves caught her by the well. "It's good you came back, little bird," the woman said, her smile kind but her tone edged. "Some threads can't be cut, no matter how far you run." The name twisted in Aven's chest. She forced a polite nod and left with her bucket, water sloshing over the rim as her hand trembled. That evening, the Alpha's horn called them all to the great hall. The air inside was warm and crowded, firelight throwing long shadows over the walls. Maps lay spread on the table, weighed with stones, knives, and cups half full of ale. Wolves filled the benches, their voices falling to murmurs as the Alpha raised his hand. "We have trouble," he began without preamble. "The Northlanders press our borders. 2 patrols harried, snares set in our hunting grounds. Supply runs threatened. No deaths, yet." His gaze swept the hall, steady and grim. "We will answer strength with strength. Patrols doubled, watchtowers manned, every hand and every heart united. No fractures. The words rang against Aven's ribs like iron. No fractures. She felt the weight of eyes on her. Across the hall, Thorne stood with the other high-ranking wolves, storm-gray eyes fixed on her. His presence pressed against her through the bond, steady and relentless. When their gazes locked, she saw the raw truth in his expression, the regret, the vow, the longing he couldn't mask. The Alpha's voice cut through the tension. Aven, you were born to this pack. You return as a woman. Will you stand with us? The hall went silent. Aven's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to demand why he asked, as though she had a choice, as though she could refuse the pull that dragged at her heart day and night. But she forced her voice steady. I will stand, she said. A murmur rippled through the hall. Approval, relief, satisfaction. To them, it was simple. To her, it was a chain tightening. The Alpha nodded. Then let it be known. The pack is whole. Whole. The bond flared hot and merciless in her chest. Aven folded her arms and lowered her gaze, fighting to keep her composure. The pack might call her return wholeness. To her, it felt like being torn open all over again. The morning broke clear and thin, the kind of brittle light that makes every edge look sharper. Frost clung to the grass in a pale rime, and Aven's breath hung in front of her as she crossed the yard. Wolves were already moving, strapping leather, counting arrows, passing messages down the line of patrols set to sweep the south and east. Mixed patrols, the Alpha had said at dawn. No gaps, no pride. Aven found her name inked beside 8 others on the chalkboard by the armory. Beside her name, Thorne. She closed her eyes for the length of one breath. Then she shouldered her quiver and stepped into the armory's low light to check her bowstring, the fletching on each arrow, the edge of her knife. When she emerged, Thorne was waiting in the doorway, posture easy, but attention narrowed the way a river tightens at a bend. Good, he said quietly, as if they'd settled something just by standing in the same square of shade. We take the ridge to Granite Spur, drop to the alder wash, then cut back along the lower path. You set the pace. You're sure? She asked, not lifting her eyes from her bow. I said I meant to earn it, he said. That means I follow when you lead. The words landed like a stone at the center of a pond. No splash, only widening rings. She nodded once and moved out. The others fell in. Hera with the scarred lip, Sandir, too quick with a joke, Kel at the rear, as silent as shadow. Thorne fell into step beside Aven, not crowding her, not lagging, close enough that she could feel the heat of him in the chill air, far enough that she could breathe. They climbed. The ridge trail wound between boulders and scrub, the granite underfoot slick with melt. Aven's eyes read the slope the way other people read script, old slide scars where rock had given under snow, hollows where water pooled and then forgot the shape it made. The forest below them was still enough that the call of a jay seemed too loud. Tracks, Kel murmured from the rear. 2, maybe 3 wolves, light feet, hours old. Aven crouched, studying the faint depressions across a patch of thawed soil. They cut south after the spur, she said. Not ours. Thorne's mouth thinned. Northlanders. They moved on with the loosened tension of a bow drawn and held. At the spur, Aven lifted a fist and the line froze. She gestured to Sandir and Hara to spread and watch the flanks, then edged forward with Thorne until the ridge sloped into a shallow saddle. Below, the alder wash pooled pale sunlight. It looked ordinary. It felt wrong. Listen, Thorne murmured. Aven stilled. The forest hummed its usual notes, wind, faint water, a knocker bird 2 draws over tapping for insects, but under it a tremor ran, as if something in the wash had learned to hold its breath. Snare line, she said, pointing to a hair-thin shimmer belly-high across a game trail. There, and there. She traced 2 more, each anchored with cunning patience to flexible saplings. Bait, fresh, lay in a small heap in the shadow of a stone. Thorne's jaw worked. Not thrown together, placed by someone who watches more than he speaks. He looked to her. Aven nodded once. We cut them, carefully. They worked in tandem, her gloved fingers finding knots, his blade separating wire from bark with a control that spoke to how he'd learned to move around things that break when handled wrong. 2 more lines revealed themselves as they worked. One designed to pull a leg from under a wolf. Another meant to close across a throat if a head lifted too quickly. Hera hissed softly. They meant to maim and mark. Or to make us carry our wounded past an ambush, Thorne said. Kel, watch the far side. Sandir. The crack came before the name finished. A branch snapped from the far tree line, too distinct for wind, too careless for deer. The snare wire Aven held went taut, jerking against her palm as the sapling it anchored to wrenched skyward. Down, Thorne said, and was already moving. Arrows scythed out of the shade. The first missed Aven by a hand's width and bit the alder trunk behind her with a sound like a nail in green wood. The second would have taken her at the collarbone if Thorne's shoulder hadn't slammed into her, knocking her into the hollow behind the stone. Pain jolted up her elbow as she hit. The arrow that should have taken her heart drove into Thorne's back instead with a dull, obscene sound. Time did a strange thing then, stretched and narrowed both at once. Aven's breath punched out of her. Thorne's mouth opened without sound. He staggered forward onto one knee, one hand braced in the leaf litter, an arrow jutting from high left of his back, too near the shoulder, too near the lung. "Thorne," she said, too loud. She grabbed him by the forearm, dragging him behind the stone as another volley slashed overhead. "Stay down." "I can—" He coughed, then bit it off. 2 shooters, east and north. His voice was iron, poorly wrapped in cloth. Aven shoved her fear into a small box and slammed the lid. "Hera, smoke!" she snapped. "Kel, push left to the fallen pine. Sandir, right flank, 2 trees out, draw their eyes." "Yes." "Aye, on it," flicked back to her. Good wolves. Wolves who trusted orders even when the one giving them was not the beta standing beside them. Thorne's hand closed on her wrist. Heat flared at the contact, bond and blood, and the animal part of her that did not care about ranks or borders. His grip was strong. "Aven, don't stand up into a line you can't see." "You think I've survived this long by being careless?" she shot back, but her mouth tried to shape a smile and failed. He let go. "No, you're careful," he said, and in the middle of being shot at and bleeding, he managed something like awe. Careful doesn't mean timid. Smoke bloomed low and sudden as Hera sparked resin-rich tinder and rolled it with a practiced kick across the wash. The haze tumbled up and spread, stinging eyes. Aven counted heartbeats, not seconds, then rose into a crouch and put an arrow through the dark between 2 alders where the east shooter had shown his hand. A shout. Flesh sound. She had him. The north arrow man loosed blindly and cut only smoke. Kel's low whistle signaled he'd slipped to the pine. Sandir, laughing like a man in a tavern and not in a skirmish, loosed twice quick and drew fire like a banner draws bees. Aven moved. She didn't think. She simply let the rhythm of the fight carry her, knock, draw, loose, then slid sideways in the smoke the way water finds a new channel. Her third arrow took the north shooter in the thigh. He screamed and snapped at the shaft like a fox in a trap. "Hold," Thorne gritted, and there was steel in it even through the pain. "Don't chase a scream." She didn't. She waited. Smoke thinned. Silence changed key, the kind of quiet that comes when the men on the other side decide they don't love their odds anymore. Branches rattled as bodies withdrew the way rats run, fast, low, eager to be anywhere but here. "Clear," Kel called after a count of 30. "They're falling back north." Aven exhaled a breath she hadn't known she was saving. The moment she let it go, everything else came roaring in. Thorne's blood, the ugly angle of the arrow, the way his hand whitened against the ground. She turned to him. "Let me see." "Don't pull it," he said, jaw locked. Barbed? She studied the shaft's make, the way the fletching was fixed, the coppery reek of the sap smear at the tips. Barbed, and smeared with something but not wrought. Resin? Bitter root? She sniffed and tasted cool metal on the air. No, ironwort. It slows bleeding. She slid her knife under the fletching and cut the shaft short to keep it from jarring. They wanted a live prisoner. Not today, he said, and tried to smirk. It cracked halfway to a grin and collapsed into a grimace. Hold still. Her hands were steady. She wrapped cloth tight around the wound to anchor the arrow in place, padding either side so it wouldn't saw deeper with each breath. When she leaned close to secure the binding, his breath brushed her cheek, warm, unsteady. The bond surged so strong it made her dizzy. She kept her voice even. You just took an arrow meant for me. Instinct, he said. Instinct or penance? It came out sharper than she wanted, but the sight of his blood made everything in her bristle. He closed his eyes once, slow. Both. Silence pressed in around them again, not empty now, but full of the things they had not yet said and might not have the courage for later. She sat back on her heels. The others hovered a pace off, poised and ready. We fall back along the ridge, Aven said. Slow. Kel, you take point. Sandir, watch the low ground. Hara, every 50 paces you stop and listen like the gods fell asleep and left you the night for a pillow. They moved. Thorne did not complain, though the climb set sweat on his brow and pulled a sound from him he strangled in his throat. Twice he stumbled. Twice Aven took his weight without making a ceremony of it. At the lip of the last rise before the camp came back into sight, she called a halt. Water, she said. We flush the wound when the healer has hands and light. Thorne's mouth quirked. You needn't say healer like it's an indictment of my pride. It is, she said, and then gentled it. And of my worry. He studied her face as if the shape of those words were something he had wanted to memorize for years. I can walk. I know, she said, but you don't have to do it alone. The words seemed to jar something loose in him. He looked out over the valley, where the pack ground smoked and glinted and breathed like any living thing, and let his shoulders drop a fraction. When I called you little bird, he said, voice low, it wasn't to make you small, not in my head, even if it sounded like that in my mouth. Aven kept her eyes on the horizon. The bond hummed alive. How did you mean it? Like something I couldn't catch, he said. Something quick and bright that didn't belong in my hand. I told myself if I didn't reach for you, I couldn't break you. He swallowed. I broke you anyway. Wind crawled over the ridge and lifted a strand of her hair. She tucked it behind her ear slowly to give herself the measure of a breath. You think saying that fixes it? She asked, not unkindly. No, he said. I think doing this does. He gestured with his chin, not at his wound, not at the blood that had soaked his shirt, but at the shape of the patrol moving as one, at the distance they had walked without losing themselves, at the fact that when the moment came, he had put his body between her and harm with no calculation at all. Day after day, until one day you believe me, or you don't, and I go on anyway because you asked me to stand with the pack and I said I would. The simple steadiness of it scraped raw places inside her. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say stop. She only said, then keep walking. They did. By the time the palisade rose before them, the sun had burned the frost off the grass and turned the air thin and bright. The gate guards shouted, and the yard bent around them as news outran their feet. Northlanders on the south line, a sprung snare, the beta hit but upright. The healer met them at the armory door with sleeves already rolled. Aven transferred Thorne into her hands only when she was sure the older woman's grip was firm. She turned to leave. Aven, Thorne said, And when she looked back, his eyes held a plea he didn't shape into words. He didn't need to. She stepped close enough that the others couldn't read her mouth and kept her voice just above a whisper. "There was no one," she said, letting his earlier words come back to him like a returned arrow. "For me, either. Not really." Shock and relief crashed through his features so fast they left him unguarded. He nodded once, as if he'd been given a map he'd dreamt of and never expected to hold. "Then I'll be worthy of that," he said, "or I'll die trying." "Don't," she said, and the word caught on something that wanted to be a laugh and wasn't. "We've already tried nearly losing you today. I find I don't care for it." The healer cleared her throat. "If you two are done trading vows like teenagers behind the bakery, I've an arrow to remove." Thorne's mouth tugged, almost a smile. He let himself be drawn inside. Aven stood in the doorway, a heartbeat longer, the yard's noise sliding past her like water past a stone. She should have gone to report, to debrief, to add the markings to the map where the snares had been set. Instead, she pressed her palm to the doorframe to steady the way her body had decided to sway now that danger had ended. Hara appeared at her elbow, wiping smoke from her face. "You lead well," she said simply. "So does he," Aven replied before she could stop herself. Hara's gaze slid toward the healer's door. "He bleeds like the rest of us." "Today he bled for me," Aven said. Hara's mouth tilted. "Good. Makes the stories easier to tell." Aven huffed, half a laugh, half a sigh. "Stories?" "The kind the pups ask for when the dark sits heavy," Hara said. "The kind with proof in them." She bumped Aven's shoulder with her own, companionable as a cousin. "Go. Mark your snares on the map. Tell the Alpha where to put the teeth." Aven went. She stood over parchment and stone and ink with her hands steady and her voice clear. When she finished, the Alpha nodded like a man filing away a necessary tool where he'll find it in the dark. "Good work," he said. "You and the Beta move in lockstep." "We don't," Aven said, surprising herself. "We move together when we must. That's enough." He grunted, which for him was something like approval. "The pack is stronger for it." When she stepped out into the yard again, the healer's door was still closed. She didn't pace. She didn't wait by the threshold like a girl at a gate. She walked to the well, drew water, and splashed her face until the chill made her gasp. She stood with her palms flat on the stone rim and let the day's pieces settle where they chose. There was no triumph in her. There was no surrender either. There was the simple, astonishing fact of still being here. "Little bird." She looked up. Thorne stood a few paces away, shirt laced loose to keep from pulling the new bandage, color high in his cheeks, pain carefully hidden but not denied. The healer had done her work. The arrow was out. He looked wrung out and steadier for it. "You should be lying down," she said. "I should be a dozen things," he said, and his mouth shaped something that might one day be a grin on easier days. "But the Alpha wants a report I can't give if I'm asleep." She shook her head. "Of course he does." He took a step closer, then stopped himself and set his weight back as if relearning the new borders. "You gave me a truth at the door," he said. "I won't lay a matching truth at your feet like a debt paid. I'll stack them where you can see them, one by one." She held his gaze. "Then start with this, tomorrow's watch." "I'll be there," he said. "On time," she added. "Earlier than that," he said. Against her will, a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Bring a warmer cloak. We'll take the ridge before the sun." "I'll bring two," he said. She nodded once and turned away, not to flee, not to deny, but to keep the momentum of the day from tipping into something too fragile to carry in public. The bond thrummed, not vicious now, not kind, just undeniable. It would not heal overnight. It did not need to. The work had begun. Behind her, Thorne's voice carried, low only for her and the morning that would come. "There was no one but you," he said again, not as a plea, not as a defense, but as a simple, staked truth driven into the ground between them. Aven didn't turn. She didn't need to. She let the words settle where the hollow had lived for 2 long years, and for the first time, something answered from the inside that did not sound like loneliness. It sounded like a beginning. The bond is undeniable, but their trials are only beginning. Tune in for part 3, the conclusion to this series on my channel. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss it.